How does a small patrol survive when the jungle itself seems to be closing in on them? What happens when retreat is impossible, ammunition is limited, and the enemy outnumbers you 10 to 1? And more importantly, would discipline and silence matter more than firepower when every mistake means death? Before we go any further, ask yourself this question and leave your answer in the comments. Do you believe survival in war depends more on courage or on control? If this kind of real history matters to you, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share your thoughts below. Your comment keeps these stories alive. In the years 1966 and 1967, deep inside Phuoc Tuy province in South Vietnam, Australian soldiers were fighting a war very different from the one shown in films. There were no clear front lines, no visible enemy formations advancing in daylight. Instead, there was jungle. Dense, wet, suffocating jungle. And within it, an enemy who knew every trail, every shadow, every place where sound died and movement betrayed life. Australian troops from the Royal Australian Regiment were tasked with long-range patrols far from main bases. These patrols were small by necessity. 10 men, sometimes 12, rarely more. They moved slowly, often for days, carrying everything they needed on their backs, knowing that extraction was never guaranteed. Radio contact could fail. Support might be hours away. And once inside Viet Cong-controlled territory, the patrol was effectively alone. The Viet Cong understood this terrain as an extension of themselves. They did not rush into combat. They watched, they followed, they waited. Their goal was rarely an immediate firefight. Instead, they sought encirclement, gradual pressure, closing off escape routes without being seen, wearing down nerves before bullets ever flew. Australian patrol commanders were trained to recognize the signs. A snapped branch where no wind had blown, footprints that suddenly vanished, the sense of being observed without seeing anyone. When contact occurred, it often did not begin with an explosion, but with a single shot, sometimes two, just enough to test reactions. In several documented encounters during this period, Australian patrols found themselves surrounded by forces estimated to be several times their number. Not a single mass of fighters, but dozens scattered through the jungle forming invisible rings. The danger was not annihilation in a charge. The danger was paralysis, panic, a single mistake that would freeze the patrol in place. What separated survival from destruction was not heroism in the cinematic sense. It was doctrine. Australians were trained never to break into blind flight. Running in the jungle was suicide. Instead, they shortened their formation. They limited fire to confirmed targets. Every round mattered. Every movement had to be deliberate. Rather than attempting to escape backward, they advanced, meter by meter, clearing narrow arcs of fire, using the terrain not as cover, but as a funnel, forcing the enemy to reveal themselves if they pressed closer. Retreat was not a rush. It was controlled movement under pressure, designed to fracture the encirclement without triggering chaos. The Viet Cong expected panic. What they encountered instead was silence, discipline and refusal to collapse. These encounters were rarely recorded as named battles. They appear in after-action reports, patrol logs, and the quiet testimony of men who survived them. Yet taken together, they explain a shift that occurred during the war. Australian patrols began to be treated differently, with caution, with distance, with respect born not from fear, but from experience. And this raises another question worth asking in the comments. If you were surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off from help, would you advance, or would you run? Inside the jungle of Phuoc Tuy, the Australians made their choice, knowing that the next few meters would decide whether they would ever leave alive. As the pressure tightened, and the enemy began to close in even further. The tightening of the encirclement was rarely sudden. It came as pressure, not impact. Shots from different directions, spaced just far enough apart to confuse distance and numbers. The Viet Cong did not need to kill immediately. Their objective was to fix the patrol in place, to force them to waste ammunition, to slow their movement until exhaustion and fear did the work. Australian patrol leaders understood this pattern well. Firing wildly was forbidden. Every burst had to be justified. Every target had to be seen. In the jungle, sound traveled farther than sight, and careless fire only revealed position and intent. Silence, paradoxically, became a weapon. As the patrol advanced through thick vegetation, movement was reduced to hand signals and eye contact. Sweat-soaked uniforms. Leeches clung to skin unnoticed. Breathing had to be controlled. because even breath could be heard at close range. The men knew that somewhere ahead, and on both flanks, eyes were watching. Fingers rested on triggers, not in tension but in readiness. The Viet Cong advantage was numerical, but numbers meant little if they could not be concentrated. Australian doctrine exploited this weakness. By keeping the formation tight and advancing deliberately, they denied the enemy the chance to strike from all sides at once. Any attempt to close in would expose a fighter to immediate fire. In several encounters from this period, patrol reports describe enemy probes rather than assaults. A figure darting between trees, a muzzle flash that vanished instantly. These were not attacks meant to overwhelm, but to test resolve, to see if the Australians would hesitate, freeze, or retreat blindly. They did none of those things. Instead, patrols adjusted their axis of movement, not toward safety as it appeared on a map, but toward terrain that limited enemy options. Narrow trails, slight rises in ground, areas where vegetation thinned just enough to extend visibility by a few meters. In jungle warfare, those few meters could decide life or death. One of the most dangerous moments came when contact persisted for too long. Ammunition levels dropped, water ran low, radios crackled with interference. The enemy presence felt closer, more confident. This was the point at which many units, untrained or inexperienced, would break. Australian soldiers were trained specifically for this moment. Fire teams rotated point positions to avoid fatigue. The wounded, if any, were moved to the center without halting the patrol. No one was left behind. No one rushed ahead. Progress was slow, but it never stopped. This constant forward pressure disrupted the Viet Cong plan. Encirclement depended on predicting movement. When the patrol refused to behave as expected, the rings loosened, gaps appeared, a fighter hesitated, another repositioned, and in those seconds, the Australians pushed through. It was not victory in the traditional sense. No ground was held, no enemy force was destroyed outright. Survival was the objective, and survival was achieved through discipline rather than dominance. These encounters began to shape Viet Cong perceptions. Australian patrols were no longer seen as easy targets for harassment. They were unpredictable. They did not flee, they did not overreact. They absorbed pressure and continued moving, even when logic suggested withdrawal. This raises another question worth considering and worth answering below. Is strength in war measured by how hard you strike or by how calmly you endure? By late 1966, this reputation had consequences. Viet Cong units became more cautious when Australian patrols were suspected in an area. Contact was delayed. Engagements were avoided unless numbers were overwhelming. The jungle, once an ally of the unseen enemy, was no longer a guaranteed advantage. But caution did not mean safety. As patrols moved deeper, farther from support, the margin for error narrowed even further, and in the next encounters, the Australians would face moments where discipline alone might not be enough, as the enemy adapted and the jungle offered fewer paths forward. As the war progressed into 1967, the Viet Cong did not abandon their tactics. They refined them. Where earlier encounters relied on gradual pressure, newer engagements introduced layered deception, false withdrawals, deliberate silences. Moments where the jungle seemed suddenly empty, only to erupt seconds later from an unexpected direction. Australian patrols learned to distrust calm. Silence no longer meant safety. In fact, it often signaled preparation. There were documented instances where patrols advanced through areas that appeared uncontested, only to realize they were being guided into tighter terrain, narrow corridors of vegetation, low ground bordered by thicker growth, places where movement could be restricted without obvious signs. The Viet Cong understood that encirclement did not always require numbers close at hand. It required anticipation. When contact was re-established under these conditions, the pressure was heavier. Fire came from closer range. Distances collapsed. Reaction time shortened to seconds. This was the most dangerous phase of jungle combat, where visibility shrank to meters and every sound carried intent. Australian response remained consistent, but now demanded absolute precision. Fire discipline became stricter, not looser. Shots were aimed, not sprayed. Grenades were used sparingly, never blindly. The objective was not suppression, but clarity, to see even briefly where the threat actually was. One patrol report from this period describes a situation where enemy fire came from 3 directions at once. The patrol halted, not in panic, but in assessment. Rather than attempting to push immediately, they shifted laterally, forcing one flank to disengage. When the pressure eased by seconds, they advanced through the opening without accelerating, denying the enemy a clear signal of weakness. This refusal to behave emotionally confused their opponents. The Viet Cong relied on psychological collapse as much as physical destruction. Fear, once triggered, spread faster than bullets. Australian training focused on denying that trigger. Commands were quiet, movements were deliberate. Even under fire, voices remained controlled. Another factor often overlooked was endurance. Patrols operated at the edge of physical limits. Hunger, dehydration, infection, and exhaustion were constant. Yet movement continued. The enemy expected fatigue to force mistakes. Instead, the Australians adjusted pace, not direction. Slower steps, shorter bounds, but always forward. In some cases, the patrol did not fully break contact until nightfall. Darkness in the jungle was not relief. It multiplied danger, but it also neutralized numerical advantage. At night, large enemy formations risked confusion and friendly fire. Australian patrols used this to disengage further, maintaining cohesion while the enemy hesitated. These moments did not produce dramatic tallies. No body counts worthy of headlines. What they produced was survival without collapse. Over time, these repeated outcomes altered the operational environment. Viet Cong units began assigning larger forces when Australians were suspected nearby, which paradoxically reduced flexibility. Larger units moved slower. They left more signs. They became easier to detect and avoid. This created an unspoken equilibrium. Australians did not seek large engagements. The Viet Cong avoided close pressure unless conditions were perfect. The jungle remained lethal, but no longer absolute. And this leads to another question worth placing in the comments. When both sides learn and adapt, does war become less brutal or simply more precise? By the end of 1967, Australian patrol doctrine had proven itself repeatedly, but not without cost. Every successful breakout carried the weight of near failure. Every meter gained could have been the last. And in one particular sequence of encounters, the margin narrowed to almost nothing, as patrols found themselves not just surrounded, but deliberately funneled into ground where doctrine would be tested to its absolute limit. In those moments where terrain collapsed into constraint, doctrine faced its harshest trial. There were areas in Phước Tuy where vegetation thickened into walls, where movement was reduced to single file, and where elevation offered no advantage. Here the Viet Cong attempted something more decisive: compression. Instead of surrounding loosely, they pushed inward, betting that space itself would run out. For an Australian patrol, this was the nightmare scenario: limited visibility, limited maneuver, and an enemy willing to accept losses to force a break. Firefights at these distances were brief and violent. There was no room for error. A single misstep could expose the entire group. Yet even here, the response was not to rush. The patrols shortened further. Fire teams overlapped fields of view by meters, not angles. Each man knew exactly which patch of ground was his responsibility. The jungle became a grid, not chaos. When enemy pressure intensified, patrol commanders often chose the least intuitive option, slowing down even more. This denied the Viet Cong the momentum they needed. Every attempt to close distance was met with controlled resistance. Not overwhelming, but enough to stall, to force reassessment. One engagement described in post-operation analysis recounts how enemy fire increased dramatically over a short span, suggesting an attempt to trigger a breakthrough. The Australians held position briefly, redistributed ammunition, confirmed casualties, then resumed movement along a deliberately chosen line that appeared unfavorable but reduced enemy angles. The choice was not obvious. It was calculated. The Viet Cong fighters, accustomed to exploiting hesitation, found none. Instead, they faced a force that absorbed pressure without signaling stress. This created uncertainty, and uncertainty in close combat is fatal. Another overlooked element was trust. Each soldier depended entirely on the man beside him. There was no room for individual heroics. No one surged forward. No one lagged behind. Survival depended on cohesion so tight that it functioned instinctively. As the patrol edged forward, contact began to fragment. Fire that once came from multiple directions narrowed. Gaps widened. The encirclement did not shatter dramatically. It eroded, piece by piece, until movement became possible again. These were not clean exits. They were measured escapes under constant threat. But they worked. What emerged from these encounters was not a myth but a reputation grounded in repetition. The Viet Cong learned that surrounding Australian patrols did not guarantee destruction. It often resulted in prolonged contact with limited gain. Time, ammunition, and fighters were expended with no decisive outcome. This realization influenced enemy behavior. Pressure tactics shifted toward avoidance and harassment rather than closure. The jungle remained contested, but the balance had changed, and this invites another question for those watching. When an enemy refuses to panic, does intimidation lose its power? By this stage of the war, Australian patrols were not invincible. Losses occurred, mistakes were made, but the core principle held: discipline created options where none seemed to exist. As patrols continued operating deep in contested territory, the enemy faced a dilemma: escalate commitment and risk exposure, or disengage and concede movement. Neither option was ideal. The jungle had not chosen a victor. It had revealed a truth. Survival did not belong to the strongest force, but to the one that refused to collapse when surrounded. And in the final phase of these encounters, the lesson would become unmistakable, as the Australians emerged not triumphant, but alive, leaving behind an enemy forced to reconsider every assumption they had brought into the jungle. By the time these patrols re-established distance from the enemy, there was rarely a sense of victory. There was no cheering, no celebration, only awareness. Awareness of how close collapse had come and how thin the line truly was between survival and disappearance in the jungle. Extraction, when it came, was often delayed. Helicopters could not always reach dense canopy. Landing zones had to be secured, sometimes carved out under threat. Until then, the patrol remained alert, knowing that contact could resume at any moment. The Viet Cong did not always disengage fully. Sometimes they watched, waiting for weakness that never came. What endured from these encounters was not a single battle, but a pattern. Again and again, small Australian units, isolated and outnumbered, refused to behave as the enemy expected. They did not break. They did not scatter. They did not surrender initiative to fear. This is why these moments matter. They do not change the outcome of the Vietnam War. They do not rewrite strategy or shift political decisions, but they reveal something more precise: how discipline functions under pressure, how training, when internalized, replaces instinct, how survival becomes an act of control rather than force. The Viet Cong adapted, as all effective forces do, but adaptation cuts both ways. Each failed encirclement reduced confidence. Each prolonged engagement without result drained resources. Over time, Australian patrols became obstacles rather than opportunities. In quiet assessments after the war, veterans rarely spoke of heroics. They spoke of spacing, of noise discipline, of the importance of not firing unless necessary, of trust in the man beside you. The jungle did not reward bravery alone. It punished excess. And perhaps that is the final lesson. When surrounded 10 to 1, survival did not come from aggression, nor from retreat. It came from refusing to surrender decision-making to chaos, from advancing when retreat seemed logical, from choosing patience when panic was expected. So here is the question that remains, and it is not just about war. When pressure closes in and options disappear, do you react or do you decide? Leave your answer in the comments. These encounters faded into reports and memories, but their meaning endures. In the jungles of Phước Tuy, far from headlines and history books, Australian soldiers proved that being outnumbered does not mean being defeated. Sometimes it simply means the test has begun.